Stand by for Stu's show, coming up next. From Chatsworth, California, Shocus Internet Radio presents Stu's Show. 2 hours of terrific conversation with great personalities from the world of television, both in front of and behind the cameras, plus your live phone calls. And now, here's the host of Stu's Show, Stu Shostak.
Oh, yes, indeed. We are back from beautiful Pine Mountain Club. And one person who had such a good time with us up there that she stuck around and said, I want to be part of your show on Wednesday afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, the very beautiful, lovely, and talented Miss Janine Kaysen.
Hello, everybody in Internet land.
That's right. You did have a lot of fun with us. Did you not? Did you not? You
yes,
did.
I did not. I know I did.
Pardon me. Get close to the microphone if you're going to be funny.
Yes, I did. I had a ball.
All right. Well, you're going to have a bigger ball today because we are doing a show this afternoon, folks, that I have been looking forward to since like November when I told this gentleman I wanted him on my show. If you are a fan of animation, you have come to the right place today because I have somebody who is an utmost authority on the Max Fleischer studio, even more so than Jerry Beck. Yes, even more so than Jerry Beck. And that's what we're going to discuss in the second hour of our show today. But in the first hour, we're going to find out about this gentleman's career, his long career himself, because he is an animator and an animation director and a historian, and he runs an incredible website called Inkwell Images Inc. with a K.com. He is a great guy, and he did commentary just recently on a Warner Brothers release of their animation, of the DVD Animation Academy Award-winning box set. He did some brilliant commentary on Popeye meets Sinbad the Sailor, and I'd like all of you right now to meet the one and only Mr. Ray Pointer!
Well, thank you, Steve. Thank you for having me.
All right, studio audience, have a seat. That's very good. I have been looking forward to this for months, sir. I have you across from me now. And there's dead silence in the studio, which is always a good thing. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much.
You have actually, too, you've become a regular listener to the station.
Absolutely.
This guy actually listens to Dwight Curran. Yeah, and we were talking about that at lunch. And anyway, it's nice to have you here. For our first hour today, folks, we are going to talk about Ray's life and career. And in the second hour, we will cover some of the Fleischer Studio stuff that we didn't cover with Jerry Beck. There was a lot more than what we did. And I'm sure there's a lot of listeners out there today that didn't even hear the broadcast I did with Jerry Beck on the Fleischer Studios, and that was back in June of last year, so it's plenty of time. But Ray is a historian, and he made it his business to learn as much about the Fleischer Studio as humanly possible. And I think we were also talking, Ray, you are probably one of the few historians out there who actually met Max Fleischer, right?
I believe that's true.
Yeah. There have been a lot of books written, or some books written on the Fleischers, Max and Dave and The Offspring and Seymour Keitel and all of those, Dave Tendlar, all the people that work there, but very few people met any of the Fleischers, very few of those authors, and you had the privilege of meeting Max, and we will get to that shortly. Let's talk first, though, about your life. You were born in Detroit,
Michigan.
Detroit,
Michigan.
In 1952.
I came off the assembly line at Henry Ford Hospital.
Yes. And that was named, of course, for the gentleman who invented the Ford car.
That's correct.
He not only has a car named after him, but he has a hospital. Anything else in Detroit that they named after him? A bowling alley or a supermarket or something?
Well, there was
like
an auditorium, which I understand they're going to be tearing down now, unfortunately, but it was a very good auditorium where the Detroit Symphony used to perform all the time, and they would also do radio concerts and so on.
Now, at that time, as a youth growing up, was the whole, outside of the Jam Handy organization, which we will discuss in a second, was the whole thrust of living in Detroit the fact that it was the car capital of the world? I mean, did you live and breathe General Motors and Ford and all of that as a kid growing up?
Oh, no, not at all. In fact, my father didn't even work in those industries. But when I went to school, about every fourth kid worked for either Chrysler or Ford.
The kids? Boy, slave labor laws.
Their fathers.
Oh, their fathers. Okay, yeah, I was going to say, they're putting the
fathers.
kids to work there. No wonder they crank those things out so fast. But you as a youth, you always had an artistic ability, right? You could draw better than any kid in your class. You always had an inkling. Did you know then that you wanted to get into animation and artwork and graphics and cartoons and all that?
I think to some degree, because it goes back to some of the first things I saw on television, I believe.
Yeah, you mentioned at lunch you were distinctly remember when the UM&M and the AAP cartoons came to television. You saw those the first time they were released.
Oh, yes. I was a preschooler when those first came to television in 1955-56. And actually, I cite my mother as the source of this interest because in those days they were showing a lot of those old theatricals that were 25, 30, almost 40 years old. So just about anything that had been released at that time ended up on television. So I got exposed to a lot of things before parental groups were formed and censorship and all that sort of thing. But aside from an awareness of that, I think just the general impression that I got from seeing things like Out of the Inkwell, and because of the content of those, created an interest in being an artist or being a cartoonist, because there we had Max Fleischer as the credible artist who drew these many things with pen and ink and so forth, and they would come to life, and that fascinated me.
Those Coco cartoons, now, they ran those on TV. Were those the silents that they eventually put music tracks onto? Is that what you saw, or did you see the ones from the 30s?
Well, there weren't any of those in the 30s. These were the original silent ones, and to my memory, they had some kind of music playing to them. That I didn't pay any attention to.
What I was getting at was you had this dream when you were a kid about meeting Max Fleischer in a dream. Tell everybody about this subliminal thing that hit you. You were like 4 or 5, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, this is a sort of a thing that indicates my perspective on this entire subject, because what I'm about to talk about is not a clinical review of his career, as a lot of people have covered, because this is something I've lived, and it even goes back to these impressions on television. I was so impressed with the first seeing of Out of the Inkwell on television that I had a dream. And it was so real, it was as if I woke up the next morning and there was Out of the Inkwell on television. So I approached the television screen, and like Alice through the looking glass, I stepped through the television screen.
Now, we're talking about the dream here. You didn't
That's
break
right.
your parents' television.
No.
Okay.
I knew better.
Yes, okay.
Besides that, even at that young age, I could think far enough ahead to realize cause and effect.
Cause, effect. Boom. Or actually, probably that.
That's true. Or something even worse. But when I stepped through the glass, then I was suddenly in a black and white world, just like the image that you're seeing on the television. And it was so interesting because I remember being in some sort of nondescript room that was sort of faded off in the background, but there was a bare wooden floor, and then there was a wooden office desk, and there was Max Fleischer seated in a captain's chair, and it swiveled around, and he turned to me like an old uncle and picked me up on his lap and was talking to me, and he said, "Well, Ray, I'm glad you came by to see me. Now here's my triangle, and here's my T-square, and here's my crow-quill pen." And then there was a great big ink bottle, and he said, "Now, Ray, I'm going to bring out the ink bottle, and the clown's going to come out." And I wanted to see the clown. And Coco stuck his head out and looked around. Then he saw me, and he ducked down in with a little splash. And I wanted to see the clown. So I went to reach for it with my little stubby fingers, and as I was dragging it forward, it sort of caught on the desk, and it tipped forward with a big splash of ink. And as a reflex, Max jumped up and dropped me, and when I'd hit the floor, I'd fallen out of the bed upside down, one leg tangled up in the quilt, sort of like little Nemo. And I had sort of a little bit of a trauma after that. Not so much that I hated the cartoons, but I realized years later why I didn't like black ink. Because of all these things were wiggling around so forth, and I'd sort of pull back, and I'd watch, and I'd say, yeah, that's okay. I'm enjoying this, but I'll be glad when it's through.
So, and that was the start of it. So after you got over the trauma, your love for cartoons never went away after that.
Oh, no. I was always fascinated by a lot of those things and very motivated.
Now, a few years later, you actually started making films when you were like 10, right? Like 5th grade? Were they animated?
Yes.
What kind of films could you do at age 10? Would you have like an 8mm movie camera?
That's right.
And what did you do exactly?
Well,
did you do stop action stuff, or did you actually draw and shoot it frame by frame?
I drew them. Well, there was a girl I was friendly with, and she and I used to go to the Art Institute on Saturdays for special ability art. And so she and I were really interested in animation, and we would copy the characters and draw them and so forth, like the J. Ward characters and the Hanna-Barbera characters and so forth. And so I think I pretty much learned from copying the Hanna-Barbera characters.
Really? So you were into Huckleberry Hound and Yogi Bear and
all
all
that
stuff.
stuff. We loved all of that. And watching the segments on the Woody Woodpecker show as well. When
Walter Lantz, yeah.
Walter Lantz would spend 5 minutes going through each step. That's really how I learned. Of course, I looked at a lot of the Disney programs too, but the Disney point of view on that kept you mesmerized so that you never really understood how they did it.
Whereas Lance would say, all right, kids, draw the beak. And you did the beak. And it was
he would very patiently spend 5 minutes on each detail. And that's how I learned. That's how I understood the process. And then, too, I would read just about anything that was available on the subject. Mm-hmm. So I was an avid reader. There really wasn't an awful lot out there at the time teaching animation so much, other than the classic Preston Blair book and little entries in encyclopedias that were from an historical point of view.
Now, did you make up your own characters for these cartoons, or did you draw Yogi and Boo Boo and things like that?
No, I made up my own characters that were sort of influenced, I guess you'd say, by Ed Benedict's designs for Hanna-Barbera.
Yeah,
mm-hmm. Yeah, but they were still original too. And
these were silent, right?
Well, we're getting into that. We'll get into that.
I'm jumping the gun here because you're getting into the kind of stuff that I did. I did live action films, and for a soundtrack, I used my reel-to-reel tape deck.
Right,
yeah,
right.
Okay.
Well, when I was 10, for that first year, I created these characters of my own, and I put them in stories, and I did them on 8.5 by 11 pages. And what I usually do, since I wasn't advanced enough to come up with stories that well, if I'd see a story on television that I'd like, I'd recast that story and put my cast in it.
Okay.
And that's how I started out. And the kids liked it. You know, they recognized what the story was about, but they also appreciated the recasting and my telling of it. So that's how I got started. And so I did about 8 or 10 of these. And then when I had the opportunity to do them animated, which I wanted to do, when I was, well, that was around that same time my dad got some home movie equipment. And so for a year I kept bugging him about when he was going to take up the rest of the role so I could shoot my cartoon. So in the meantime, I started working ahead, and I created all the artwork.
How many drawings did it take you to do, an animated cartoon? We hear that it takes hundreds of thousands of drawings to do a 6-minute cartoon. How many drawings do you remember doing, and how long did your first finished cartoon end up being?
I don't remember how many drawings there were. There weren't that many because I had the Hanna-Barbera technique figured out.
Oh, you were doing limited animation at age 10. Okay.
Yeah, I had it figured out. Because the main thing is if this is your first venture and you want to see something on the screen, you want to see the results, and then you grow from there.
Okay.
And without really realizing too much, I think that was a wise decision at that time at such a young age, not to get too ambitious on your first effort, because you've got to leave some room to grow and experiment and learn and not make too many mistakes. And I think that's the mistake that a lot of people make when they try to make their first effort. They get too ambitious and try to do things that they don't know how to do.
Okay, all right. So the end result, if we skip ahead a few years ago, you made a film that won some sort of an award back there in Detroit, and how did you get involved with the Jam Handy Company? And let's tell us that first, and then tell us a little bit about Jam Handy for those people out there who may not have ever heard of them. They were big in the 30s and 40s, right?
Well, to answer your first question,
yeah, let's do that.
The award came 10 years later. And it sort of brought an end to my private experimental period that spanned 63 to 73. And that award was that I won the Regional Student Academy Award, Midwest region. And then, of course, it was a finalist on the West Coast. And I didn't win that. That went to Stephen Lisberger.
Was this an animated film you did, or was it a
yes.
live? Oh, it was. So tell us a little bit about the film.
It was a minute and a half thing that was basically a joke. It's called Gold Navel.
Once there was a boy who was quite like any other boy, except for one thing. He had a gold navel. It didn't matter to him that he had a gold navel, so he just didn't pay any attention to it. He had his mind on other things, and that made a gold navel unimportant at the time. So he just didn't know what it was. But being like any other growing boy, he eventually reached the stage of curiosity, and one day he asked his mother,
"What's this?"
"Oh no, leave that alone. Don't touch."
"What's it for?"
"We just don't talk about that."
"And why?"
"Because it's taboo. Now just leave it alone." Now, what have you done?
Let's go back then and talk about Jam Handy, because you got into Jam Handy when you were 15.
I just turned 15.
Yeah, so tell us about Jam Handy and then tell us how you got in there.
Well, that ties in with where we started out, and I'd been making these experimental cartoons for essentially 4 years by this time. When I started out with my experiments, I put my little cast of original characters in those to try things out. And the following year, that spring, we did an original production of The Wizard of Oz at school. And I was the Scarecrow. The teacher was adapting the script from the book. Of course, we were familiar with the story from having seen the movie on television, so when we saw the script adapted from the original book, we were seeing some of these little subtle differences, and we wondered, oh, what else is in the book? So we went to ask the school librarian if they had a copy of this book, and the school librarian was not very positive about us reading it because it was not considered good literature. Well, I wasn't going to let that stop me. I wanted to read the original story, and so I did some checking around. I found out it wasn't in general circulation within the Detroit Public Library system either. But
what was the problem with the... I don't remember reading the book and reading... because I'm illiterate, but what was different about the book than... Well, give us a little subtle difference. And maybe Janine knows. I don't know.
Well, there wasn't as much of a detail about the first chapter that describes Kansas, other than to say that Kansas was without color.
Okay, because I'm looking for a reason here as to why this book was not in circulation.
It wasn't
in
in circulation because, first of all, there were literary critics that didn't think that it had literary value.
Okay.
But the biggest criticism came up during the McCarthyism era, and the previous head of the English department for the Detroit Public Library system made a statement that hit the press saying that we do not carry the Oz series because they contain communistic ideals about a utopian concept of Oz. This gentleman later on ended up being a social studies teacher at my high school.
Did you have him?
No, I didn't. And I could understand after that experience why he might have been a little bit bitter.
Yeah. So anyway, let's talk about how you got in. Did you make a film on The Wizard of Oz?
So that's what I was doing. I saw a lot of the possibilities of making this as an animated vehicle. But I also analyzed the amount of work that would be necessary. Of course, every time a Disney thing would come on television, I'd watch it, would never blink because I wanted to get every detail. But I was also realistic enough to know that I wasn't equipped to do something of this nature. I'm just one person, and I'm still starting out. So I had to find a practical way of doing a half-hour film and not spend 5 or 10 years doing it, because I want to go on to other things. And I was a kid, and I had other things I was doing, and I cut grass to earn my own money, and I played softball, not very well, but at least I tried.
Mm-hmm.
And we went on vacations, and I took care of people's yards and all that sort of thing. So I did the normal things that you did in those days, and I had this as well. So I figured out a way of doing it with cutouts. And one of the things that I was interested in doing with this was to create some sort of an effect like the old Viewmaster
3D effect?
3D effects that you would do. And so I rigged up a means of raising these things on levels of glass.
Sort of like the Fleischers did.
Right.
Oh. Now, did you know at the time how the Fleischers did those stereoptic effects?
I didn't, but they certainly stood out, and I always used to wait for the opportunity to see those again and figure out how did they do that, because I can't believe that they went out into reality and did all these things, and you figure, well, I guess it's a model, but how did they do it? And, of course, within a few years, I found out how it was done. But anyway, 1964 is when I got started on The Wizard of Oz. Now, my dad, in a good mood, I guess, suggested you ought to let the people at Jam Handy see what you've done.
Now, stop there and tell everybody what Jam Handy's contribution was to the filmmaking industry being based in Detroit.
Okay. Well, Jam Handy used to be one of the foremost industrial film production companies, the Jam Handy organization. They were much more than just a film studio. They were an entire advertising organization. They would organize trade shows. They would hire actors. They would hire musicians. They would orchestrate choreography and so forth. When you would have fairs where they'd have demonstrations of products, these are the types of things that they would do, or they would do educational film strips. Whatever it had to do with media that was to promote ideas or products, that's what this company did. They also had their own research and development department at one time.
And they were big. They were huge.
Yes, they were.
Okay. All right. So your father says you ought to get this into the Jam Handy thing. Did he have some contacts there for you so you could get in?
No, not really.
How did you do it?
When I got out for summer break, I figured, well, why not? And I wrote a letter on June 30th, and I got a response the next week, and I was invited to come down the following Tuesday. And so I interviewed with this gentleman by the name of Bob Kennedy.
And did you tell him in the letter that you were 15 years old?
No, I didn't.
Oh, so they didn't know?
No.
They didn't know until you came in. Did you think he was surprised to see that you were just a young kid trying to get into the business with these experimental films?
I don't think he was that shocked, but I think he was more amused and curious. And he put me to ease right away. And of course, my father was there.
Both of you went in.
Right.
Okay, so how soon after that interview did you start showing him what you'd done? Did you bring that stuff with you?
We had a little bit of a discussion to set the whole thing up, and then we went into the camera room. So we started, it was just the two of us. So I came there with the projector and my sound on tape. And then I went into Wizard of Oz as far as I had it at that point, because I was finishing in that summer. So all during the playing of this, with the sound emanating out of the camera room, people started to drift in, and next thing I knew, I had a full house there.
And one of the people who drifted in was?
Well, as the lights came on, I saw these two little square-shaped men. And Mr. Kennedy said, I'd like to introduce you to a couple of pioneers. This is Frank Goldman and his best friend, Max Fleischer.
And you went, oh, shh.
No, not really. No, I was pleasantly surprised because this whole interest level had come full circle.
Now, it had been about 10 years since you had your dream.
That's right. And in between that, I had the good fortune when we went to visit a cousin of my father's. And usually if I was left alone in somebody's library, I'd read what was there,
Mm-hmm.
And he had this set of Richardson encyclopedias, and it had the most extensive history of animation that I had ever read, and there were all these details about Max Fleischer. And that's when I first started to get a sense of all this history. So then when I went over to Jam Handy, and Bob was telling me all about the connections with Max Fleischer, all this rung a bell. I knew what he was talking about.
So did you start hitting Max Fleischer with all of this factual information that floored him, or what happened there?
No, it was the other way around. He was asking me.
So he had seen the films that you were showing.
He said, how did you think of these ideas, these 3D ideas? And I said, well, Mr. Fleischer, I got it from seeing your cartoons, and I wanted to figure out how you could do that effect. And so that was my inspiration. Wow. And he just loved that. And I said, I found your films to be very inspirational for me, and I also learned things from them. And he said, what was that? And I said, well, I remember when I was a preschooler, there was a cartoon where Coco came out of the inkwell and he broke off a corner of a Hershey bar that was on your desk and ate it, and then he got a toothache. And I learned to brush my teeth.
Well, let's give him 2 seconds of applause for that and for the cartoon. So your encounter with Max Fleischer was short, right? Just a few minutes?
It was 20 minutes that I remember him quizzing me. And how long have you been doing this? He said. I said, for about 2 or 3 years in my spare time. And he said, my dear young man, you have a tremendous future ahead of you, not just in animation, but you could be a director of live action. There's so many things ahead of you. And what you have done in those few years is far more than it would take us 5 years to train people.
Oh, my goodness. Now, was Mr. Kennedy within earshot of this?
He was there.
And that's probably why you got the job, right? You think that helped?
It didn't hurt. So after that famous meeting with Max Fleischer, Bob Kennedy said to me, well, would you like to go to work for us? And I very seriously said, as soon as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And I meant it.
This was during the summer, right?
Right,
okay.
Right. So he asked me to come back in 2 days, and so I had to go and get a work permit because you had to be 16. And we kind of fudged that a little bit. My mother signed a paper. And it worked out because she worked in the accounting department at Midwest Paper, which was just down the street. So I would come in and I would work from 10 until 4:30. And she was getting off work, so she was passing by, and she'd pick me up and all that. And if on occasion, if they wanted to work me past 4:30, they would call my mother and say, can we keep Ray another hour and a half? And Mr. Kennedy would take me home. That's the kind of people that we worked with. They were very responsible, family-oriented people, and they looked out for your welfare.
So what'd you do?
Anything that they asked me to do.
So you're like a gopher? Or an intern, or what? What were some of your duties?
Well, not exactly what they would consider intern work, but sort of like an apprentice.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, well, first, you realize we're going to start you at the bottom level, and you're going to be painting cells. And I said, that's fine, because I understood that. And so I painted cells, and I inked. And
well, you must have dug every moment of this, then.
Oh, yeah.
Everything you did was just right up your alley.
Whatever they asked me to do, I was happy to do.
Right.
I learned to operate the Oslid copy machine. And that's a form of xerography for transferring pencil drawings onto a cell surface. But that's what I did, and then some days they would say, we want you to go in and assist one of the cameramen. And so then I got to run camera.
And they were photographing the cells,
That's right.
Oh, so man, you had it all covered. And you must have learned an incredible amount of about animation just being there as a teenager.
A little bit. I don't want this to be taken the wrong way, but fortunately, by the time I came in there, I was prepared because I'd read about all of this stuff, and now I'm finally actually touching the things.
Well, still, it must have been a thrill for
right.
you. It wasn't one of these things like, oh, I know about this. Okay, I'll do it.
And I never came in with that attitude. It was a good experience for me. I just totally loved every minute of it.